Xi'an in China, where you've probably heard of the Terracotta Warriors.
Uh-huh.
I mean, they're worth going and seeing. It's not a travel show, but let me tell you, if you can fit it into a ministry trip in China, go to Xi'an. It's spelled Xian.
Uh-huh.
But there in town is a museum with these huge stone sort of, they're like stone pillars, but they're flat and smooth, and etched onto them, they are records. They're historical records. That's, that's how we kept records in those days. Mm-hmm. And there you have the first recorded history of Christianity entering China, I think in the early 600s. Mm-hmm. And they were Nestorian Christians who did that, coming across Central Asia. So it's quite a buzz for me to see that. I mean, this is, to almost touch that era. And to know that Christianity is a more ancient faith in China than it is in many parts of, especially Northern Europe.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, speaking of China, that's a good transition. I was reading A Star in the East, The Rise of Christianity in China by Rodney Wang. Three names.
They're two authors.
Rodney
Stark and then his associate, Wang. one of his students. Wang.
So as I was reading that, it's an amazing story. Talk about the sovereign hand of God, and that's one where when we're sitting on the sidelines watching the cricket game and seeing tremendous things that God is doing in China, we're all excited about that. So one of the things that I pulled out of that is he talks about there's a misconception that the educated in cultures do not necessarily come to Christ. And he kind of debunks that theory. And so when I read that, I said, well, what's the application for the no place left folks? If the educated are coming to Christ in different parts of the world, should we do that in the West as no place left disciple makers and church planners?
Sure. Well, yes. I think we've got to break out of some of the paradigms that and assumptions that we make about who is and isn't responsive. And it is true. Even in the New Testament, there's some questioning. We get the idea that it was just the poorest of the poor in the New Testament who responded to Jesus, or when it hit the Roman world, the slaves and the like. So, well, it's just not true. Jesus spent a lot of time with people who were educated and had powerful positions in society. People say, well, we go after the marginalized like Zacchaeus. And I say, well, in what sense is Zacchaeus marginalized? Is he marginalized like a Wall Street banker would be in a political demonstration against Wall Street? Because Zacchaeus was a wealthy man who represented the establishment and part of a system that oppressed the poor. Jesus had no problem going to Zacchaeus. He was known. I mean, we say, oh, marginalized tax collector. Well, they're corrupt. Let's call them what they are: corrupt government officials. So I think, the minute we start saying, Christianity's middle class, Christianity's just for Europeans, Christianity's, it's only happening in the developing world and it's just the poorest of the poor. Well, just go back. I like to say, what did Jesus do? Not what would he do. That's when we project onto Jesus our values and assumptions. We just say, well, what did he do? Well, he's talking to a centurion, well-paid soldier with a lot of power and influence. He's also talking to people who are outcasts and bitterly poor. and offering them hope. He, on both racial, I mean, he had a historic role, theological. I'm going after Israel, but in terms of social levels, Jesus doesn't discriminate. He goes. I mean, some of the women that were with him were wealthy women who helped support the ministry. Part of the nobility. So. All that says is you do see a pattern in the New Testament of people of influence and education coming to faith. If Cornelius, the governor on Cyprus, this happens. Yeah. So, throughout history, it is a pattern that. Especially urban environments, people are open to ideas, educated people, sometimes merchants because they're traveling, all of that sort of thing. So it's important that we don't rule out certain people in society. And that is true, certainly in places like China. There are very many educated people who are putting their faith in Christ.
Yeah. And I'm looking at our own history of, student movements, both in the UK and in the States. And as I see them, very effective. I could name parachurch organization after parachurch organization that went after students, and they were the foundation, both students and military. Here's a thing that I've identified, though, that when a person is taught in that environment how to do ministry within that context, and the methods and tools and processes of discipling, evangelizing, and most of the time not church planning, but any of those methods that we're using in that context normally do not translate into the new context that they're going to be living the rest of their life in. And so it's kind of, I don't mean this in a derogatory manner, it's just true. It's a niche ministry. And one of the things that we've been strategizing with campus ministers here in the States is, why don't you, number one, use methods that translate from context to context. But number two, why don't you train your freshman and sophomore to reach the campus? But then you need to make a transition from junior to senior to get out into the community, out into the city, and make sure that they understand this is not just about your college career and how fun it was serving Jesus while you were here on the campus. And now you're going to sit in a pew for the rest of your life listening to sermons. There's a disconnect between the high-powered, very exciting ministry on a campus or a military base, and then transitioning it to the rest of life with marriage, the job, the kids, and everything. And now we can't pull that off anymore. So I think that's an important part of the strategy.
That, I think, Chuck, is so it's not just maybe our methods don't translate into this new environment, because sometimes they do. It's, has the student or the military person captured a vision for the Great Commission? Because in that student volunteer movement, which is, a real highlight of history for me, I just love what God did during that time, both in the US and in the UK, in sort of simultaneously. Was, they came out of university saying, we want to go win the world, and we're willing to go anywhere and do anything to do that. And guys like C.T. Studd ended up the far ends of in Africa, or China, India, these sorts of places. And so some of the problem with the transition, it's like when young adults get married and leave the youth group, because there's also a big, not just campus ministries, but church youth groups have a mass, either they get married or partnered or they get a car, they discover they get their entertainment somewhere else. And there's a massive falling off. And sometimes you pick them up again once they're married and they've got kids and they're looking for something as a family. They come back as a church attender. So the problem is, did the Lord ever really have a hold of them in terms of the Great Commission? Are we in this youth group or college ministry? Are we just, we're entertaining? We're providing something that eventually the world can outdo us in. Are we making disciples? And that's what I long to see. Movements amongst young people, young adults, youth groups, campus ministries, where we have a passion for Christ, and we're going to go anywhere and do anything that'll fulfill the Great Commission. And that may be to a city or a place in the United States, and it may be to the ends of the earth.
Yeah. Here's a neat story that I just got 2 days ago. Campus minister talking about how spiritually hungry students are. And he was comparing his new approach to people versus his old approach. He used to do a highly attractional thing and advertise, hey, we're going to have a water balloon fight, and all this. And he's just gotten completely away from that big event, attractional, and he's just going to students and saying, hey, are you interested in studying Jesus? And I really would be, and student after student is responding to a direct, request to journey with him to get to know who Jesus is. And it's like, wow, that's, simple. Why didn't we think of that, So anyways.
Well, and this is where it's the returning to what did Jesus do?
Yeah.
Jesus doesn't have a problem with crowds. He welcomes the crowds. He ministers to them. Communicates in a way that's engaging. He will do the crowds, but he didn't confuse the crowds with disciples. He came to make disciples, and the crowds are the fishing pool for disciples. And the move from being in the crowds to being a disciple is, will you follow me? And that means not just will you put a sticker on your car or wear a cross around your neck. Will you obey what I teach? Yeah. And so I'm thinking of an annual event here in Britain where we're based. There's upwards of 8,000 or 9,000 young people at it, and it's a huge event. Are they making disciples? I don't know, but an event's an event, and eventually, as I said, the world, if all you've got is, we can match it with, great band, a charismatic, gifted public speaker, if that's all you've got, it's not a movement, it's a fad. And eventually it will dissipate, and because the world can outdo you on those things. But I'm not saying you can't ever have the big event and the fun times, draw people. That's wonderful. Okay, minister, but call for discipleship and have clear stepping stones and tracks where people can begin to take steps of obedience around the word of God with other disciples. That's what Jesus did.
I love that about you, Steve. You always bring it back to Jesus, which I think is the most important thing. So, all right.
And just in case sometimes people get the wrong impression when I say that, because they don't understand that Jesus rose from the dead. And for me, what Jesus did is in the Gospels, But the full stories are Gospels and Acts and epistles, because Jesus rose from the dead. And what he began in the Gospels, he continues to do in the book of Acts. I don't pit, Paul against Jesus, church against kingdom, all of that.
Yeah.
So I also look for the continuing ministry of Jesus throughout the New Testament. That's what he did.
Yeah. And aren't we looking for that in each other as well? Because he's still writing his story in us.
Exactly. We are living in Acts 29 now.
Yeah,
The book of Acts doesn't finish.